Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Phil. Welcome to Phil's Computer Lab. Today we're going to build a computer that looks very unassuming and modern from the outside. It hides what's inside. Turn it on and you get warped back into the good old days of retro MS-DOS gaming. The case we're using today is from A1. It's a fairly cheap case. I'm not quite sure what the model number is, but it will do the trick just fine. So this is what the case looks like with the covers removed. We're not going to use any of the USBs and the audio headers, so I've just cable tied them down here. The only cables we're going to use are these front panel headers for the LEDs and the buttons. This is the motherboard I'm going to use. It's the BioStar MB1433. It's got 3 these are local bus slots, a bunch of ISA slots, 8 megabytes of RAM, 256 kilobytes of level 2 cache, and we're using a Intel 486 DX2 running at 66 megahertz. We've got some front panel headers here for the turbo and the reset, so we will definitely use all of them. Standard keyboard connector in the back, but we're going to use one of those adapters to use a modern PS2 keyboard. And I already ran into a roadblock. While the mounting holes line up over here, it doesn't fit quite inside the case. The case basically doesn't have enough space. So this unfortunately is there's not much I can do, so I will swap out the case for a different one. Okay, this is the replacement case. This one is from Gigabyte. I'm not sure about the model, but it's a very lovely case. They don't really make cases like this anymore. It's got 4 5¼ inch and 2 3.5 inch, so lots of options for drives. We're only going to use 3 5¼ inch, so there's lots more room to put in other stuff, and we've got a lot more space in here to fit our motherboard. Just like in the other case, I cable tied the USB and the audio headers. We're not going to use them. We just need the standard power, reset buttons, hard drive LEDs, that kind of thing. Okay, here we are, and I'm just gonna line up the motherboard, and hopefully you can see that, but we've got 3 standoff holes here that line up perfectly. None of the other holes line up. So what we're gonna do is fairly straightforward. I'm gonna put some metal standoffs in here, and I'm gonna put some plastic standoffs in the other areas. So these are the standoffs. So I'm talking about the metal standoffs I'm going to use where the motherboard lines up with the holes, and the plastic ones, I'm just going to use those so that the motherboard doesn't touch the case and shorts out. Okay guys, so that's all done. Here we can see the 3 metal standoffs, and here we've got the 4 plastic ones. And this is what it looks like from the back. Here we can see the 3 metal standoffs, and here the plastic ones where I had to use the nut because the standoffs were a little bit too thin. They didn't hold properly into the thread. Okay, so the next step is installing the motherboard, and I'm just going to use 3 screws to secure the motherboard with the metal standoffs. There you go, fits very nicely. Now there's a little bit of flex on this side because there are no screws holding it down, but once we insert the expansion cards, that will hold the motherboard in place nicely. Time to fill those slots with some cards. First we've got a graphics card. This one is from Cirrus Logic. It's a Visa local bus with the GD5429 chip. That's a fairly quick chip for DOS gaming, and I've upgraded the memory to 2 megabytes of video RAM. The next card is another Visa local bus card. This is an interface card with hard drive, floppy controllers, serial, parallel, and game ports. It's got lots of jumpers, and they're all explained in the back. And I've disabled a few things, like I'm not going to use the game port because we're going to use the game port on the sound card. For the sound, we're using 2 devices. This is the classic Sound Blaster AW64 Gold, my favorite ISA sound card. Very good, has got lots of features, very quiet, and I like this card a lot. That's why it's going into this computer. Now a 486 is nothing without a proper general MIDI device, and it is the Roland Sound Canvas, of course. The version is the 55 Mark II, and we're going to use the input. So the sound canvas actually has an analog input at the back. We're going to use the input to mix the sound from the sound blaster together with the general MIDI sound from the sound canvas. So you've got a choice here. You can mix the output into the line in of the sound blaster, but I'm doing it the other way around. I'm mixing the sound blaster with the sound canvas. There you go, all the cards are installed. I'm just going to get some slot covers to cover up the holes and then secure it all down with some screws. Here we go, all the cards installed, including the slot covers. Now I just realized that the case actually has one of these contraptions to secure the cards without the screws, but I prefer them to be screwed down so they don't wiggle at all, and it's a little bit more stable. So this is what the machine looks like from the back. Do note that I don't have an ATX shield for the back. They do exist, but they're very hard to find, and they also cost quite a bit. So it's a special ATX shield that has a cutout just for the keyboard. I can't be bothered hunting one down, so I'm just gonna leave a little gap there. Okay guys, it's time to talk about storage. Now remember, and those of you who are new to my channel, I do like to mix it up. I don't pretend that the parts I'm using are the best parts. I always mix it up a little bit. So you will see me use different or unique or odd parts and ways of doing things, and it's basically to show you guys several ways of doing the same thing, accomplishing the same goal. So for storage, starting off with a standard optical drive. It's a DVD rewrite model with an IDE interface at the back, so everything is fairly standard stuff. It's jumpered to slave, so I'm going to use a single IDE cable with the optical drive configured as a slave device and the hard drive configured as master. Okay, let's have a look at the hard drive. This is what I'm going to use as a hard drive. So this is a fairly new contraption. Well, actually, I had this device for a while. This is an IDE drive caddy or enclosure which is removable. So it's got an IDE connector at the back, Molex power, a little fan, and you can, just by pulling this out, you can pull out the hard drive. But let's have a look what is inside. There's actually a little bit of a surprise. So we actually don't have a hard drive. I'm using a SD card reader. So this is an IDE to SD adapter. So we're going to use an 8 GB SD card. It's all powered up, and the IDE connects here to the back. Now, I haven't tried this yet. Hopefully it'll work. The SD adapter does not have a master-slave jumper, so hopefully it'll not have any issues with the optical drive. If the SD card doesn't work for me, I'm just going to use a compact flash adapter. Same thing, connects to the IDE, but instead of a SD card, it uses compact flash. And there's one more piece to the puzzle, also a new device that I haven't used before. It is one of these, a fairly inexpensive solution. So this is an adapter that goes in a 5¼ inch drive bay, and you can put in a 3½ inch drive. And I've got these two switches for, and we're going to use them to power on the 486. So one of them will be a power switch, and the other one will be for the turbo to slow down the machine or speed it up. So the turbo button was used to be compatible to old games. And basically at the end we just have some connectors here. One of them will go to the motherboard for the turbo, and the other one will go to the ATX to AT power converter. I'll show you that later. Now, what goes in here? Those who have watched my show before, of course, the Gotek floppy emulator. I could not live without this thing. It's got 1,000 floppy images on here, and with a single USB stick, and by just configuring these buttons and switching between the floppies, I'm going to install everything, the whole machine, in one hit. Okay, that's all done. So we've got the hard drive at the top, then the optical drive, the Gotek floppy emulator, and the power switch, as well as the turbo switch. And here we can see the drives from the inside. So the hard drive here configured to master, then we've got the optical drive configured to slave, and here's the floppy emulator. I installed them in close proximity, so hopefully I get away with using a single lead from the power supply, so two large Molex and one of the floppy Molex. The other thing that you need to make sure is that the last device on the IDE ribbon cable is master, so the one closer to the motherboard should be slave. So on a modern IDE ribbon cable, this pin is by default shut or closed, so you need to open this either by using a sharp tool and just piercing it, or you can use a paper clip and heat it up and melt it, but otherwise you're not going to get it onto the controller. The other option is you can go to the controller and clip that pin off, but it's a lot easier than it's a lot easier to mod the cable rather than muck around with the controller. Another tip with the IDE ribbon cables, on modern machines they use the key, so you can't put it on the wrong way, but on these old controllers there's no key, so you could put them on the wrong way. So how do you figure out what is the right orientation? It's very easy. There's one outside lead that is marked, you can see the red one here, and on the floppy it's white, and that indicates pin number 1. So you just got to have a look at the controller. It usually says pin number 1 on one side, and you just make sure that that lines up with the marked one. Okay, we're almost there. The final thing we have to install is the power supply. So I'm using a standard ATX power supply. This one is from FSP. It's a 500 watt power supply, totally overrated and overkill for what we need, but it's what I have, so we're just going to go with that. And then this contraption, this is a ATX to AT adapter. So this means we can power an AT motherboard using an ATX power supply. So I'm just going to wire that all up and back in a second. Okay, that's all done. I just want to point out a few important things. With the AT power, those are 2 connectors, and you're going to make sure that the black ones are together in the center. This is the lead that goes to the front to one of the switches, and this will power on the machine. I use cable ties to make a little bit less of a mess, so all the cables, the power cables that I didn't need, the SATA, the PCI Express, and the 4-pin power connector, I just cable tied them and then tied it to the back of the case. So the only power lead we need is this one, which powers the hard drive, the optical drive, the floppy drive, and also the CPU fan. So there's the CPU fan. It's a bit hard to see in the dark. It clips onto the processor, and it's got a standard Molex connector which powers the little fan. Okay, we're pretty much done. So the next step for me is to hook everything up. I'll make sure that all the LEDs and the wires, the reset button and all that, that's all working. So see you soon in a moment. Okay, so here is the moment of truth. Let's turn it on and see if everything works. So that looks pretty good. I checked all the LEDs, the power LED and the hard drive LED, that's all working. The case doesn't have a reset switch, so I couldn't wire that up. And the turbo button also works, but I'm gonna show you that later. So I'm just gonna put the covers on and install the sound canvas, and we are back in a moment. Okay, so we're connecting the Sound Blaster with the Sound Canvas. The game port doubles up as a MIDI interface, and you can get a couple of MIDI cables. This is the one I like to use because it's got a breakout cable for the joystick, so you can use both. So the joystick adapter goes into the sound card, and then on the other hand we have 2 MIDI connectors, and they're labeled. One of them says MIDI in. We're not using that one. We use the other one that says MIDI out, and the MIDI out goes into the MIDI in on the sound canvas here at the back of the unit. And to mix the sound of the Sound Blaster with the sound canvas, we just connect the RCA outputs of the AW64 Gold and connect them with the RCA inputs, which are the left ones here of the sound canvas. And then to balance the volume between the two, you just have to adjust the volume on the Sound Blaster. Okay guys, the hard work is done. Now it's all about the software and configuring the machine. So let's fire it up, and I'm just going to walk you through the whole process. The first thing I'm going to do is enter the BIOS. I'm going to load the BIOS defaults. I'm going to run the auto-detect hard disk, but we will actually not configure the hard disk at all. I'll set it to not installed, because we're going to use OnTrack, and the OnTrack software will pick up the hard drive automatically. Floppy drive 1.44 megabyte. The only other thing I'm going to change is the memory test above 1 megabyte. I'm going to disable that, and we're going to boot from a boot floppy. So I've got my Gotek floppy emulator, so I'm just going to insert that, and on the floppy ID number 2 I've got a Windows 98 start disk. Okay, so we are now in Windows 98 in the DOS mode, and I'm gonna run the OnTrack disk manager, so that's on floppy ID number 27. Okay, now I've got to switch over to boot disk. It needs the boot files, so that was on floppy ID number 2. We can also see that the hard drive activity LEDs are working just fine. So we've got 2 sets. We've got one with the hard drive bay and the other one from the case. Okay, now we're just going to reboot the machine from the hard drive. So I'm going to go back into the BIOS and change the boot order so it boots from the hard drive. Okay, so this is the OnTrack boot menu, and it now tells me to boot from an operating system disk to install the operating system. So I just have to press space and it'll boot from my Windows 98 boot disk. I'm just going to press F5 to cancel loading all the startup files. I just need a bare bones DOS to do my thing. On the C drive, I'm going to create a folder, DOS, and I'm going to copy all the files from the boot disk across. Okay, next I'll transfer the system files to the hard drive with the sys command. I'm missing one more file, the emm386.exe, which is on floppy ID 50, so I'm just going to copy that across. Let's double check. Yep, that's all good. And next I'm going to install my starter pack, the MS-DOS starter pack, which is on 38. I'll put all the links down below where you can download that stuff. And I've also done a video on this process, installing MS-DOS, because there's a little bit more to it, and I've done a video where I explain it in a bit more detail. So the starter pack is really straightforward. You just type install, and it copies a few files across, which will give you a boot menu, working CD, mouse, and so on. Okay, let's reboot the machine, and we should have a working DOS, including the start menu. Okay, there we go. So we've got the optical drive and the mouse. Should all be working. Wonderful. Okay, next up, we're going to install the Sound Blaster. So there are 2 disks. You need the Sound Blaster basic disk and the CTCM BBS disk. Both can be downloaded from the Creative website, but I've also got a backup on my website. So on 39 is the Sound Blaster basic disk. So we're just going to install that. That's going to take a while, so we're just going to fast forward that bit. Okay, quick reboot, and it should all work, loading the drivers from the configsys and autoexec batch file. Okay, that's all looking good. We can see the resources here. There's a bit of housekeeping to do, but not much, and then we're done. We're just going to tweak the mixer a little bit. We're going to mute all the inputs, the CD, the line, the microphone, and the speaker. And we're going to untick all these boxes. That should give us a fairly noise-free experience. Okay, let's save it. And we're done. And finally, I'm just going to run diagnose to check the sound card and make sure that everything works. Okay, that's all working. Let's get out of this. Okay, we're done. The next thing I'm going to do is eject the SD card, and I'm going to fill it up with some games and some benchmarks. So let me just eject this. There you go. So I'll be back in a moment with some benchmarks, and then we've got a few games and do a bit of a showcase. Okay, so I ran into 2 more issues. The SD card wouldn't show up on my desktop. I believe that's because I let the OnTrack software choose the hard drive type in the BIOS. So I haven't done that before, and usually the SD card would work in a desktop. And the other thing I realized is that the optical drive wouldn't work. So what I did, I swapped out the SD to ID adapter for a different model, and that one works with the optical drive. So obviously there are a few differences. So the second adapter I tried was compatible with the optical drive. So I just copied the benchmark from the disk rather than through the desktop. Okay guys, time to do some benchmarking. Now for benchmarking, you want to choose the boot menu option, either the last one, conventional memory only, but I usually go with extended memory. So you don't want to load any mouse drivers or CD drivers. And I've also removed the Sound Blaster drivers and stuck them into a SBlast batch file. So I can start the Sound Blaster drivers whenever I need. Now, I put together a DOS benchmark pack, and I'm almost able to make this available. I just gotta to do a bit more testing, but this will be online soon, and I'll make a video about it. And it's just a simple batch file menu with a bunch of benchmarks. So we're just gonna run them one by one, and I'll show you the results. So in 3D Bench version 1.0, we get 45.4. And this is a good time to show you the turbo function. So we just flick the switch and we can see how everything slows down. We will try a few games later, but it just shows that the turbo function is working just fine. Okay, let's try version 1.0C. That one is recommended for faster machines because it can go up to 999 frames, whereas 3D Bench 1.0 only goes up to 99 FPS. 43.5 for 3D Bench 1.0C. Let's try Chris's 3D benchmark. We're getting 27.6 FPS. Next up, we've got PC Player benchmark. Exactly 9 FPS. Next up, we have our first game, Wolfenstein 3D. This benchmark runs automatically. It's a time demo, and you need to let it run 3 times, so 3 loops, because the results get a little bit faster with each run. 70.2, so you could see how the result got a little bit faster. So the third run, 70.2 FPS. Next benchmark we have is Doom, number 8. Okay, here we go. The important number is the real ticks, and you just need to get a calculator and go 74,690 divided by 2997, and we get an FPS of 24.922. Okay, next we got Quake, number 9. Okay, 6.6 FPS. So Quake is a very demanding game for any 486 machine. Okay, I'm just going to remove the USB floppy. We don't need that anymore. And now I'm just going to run some CPU benchmarks. First up, we've got system information. So here we're getting 131.9. Next benchmark is landmark. We're getting 316.01 for the CPU and 486.32 for the floating point unit, the FPU. Then we've got top bench. We're getting a score, it's flickering between 195 and 196. And the last benchmark is SpeedSys. And here we can see some specs, the 66 megahertz of the 486. This here is logic graphics with 2 megabytes of memory, the MS-DOS version 7.1. And here we can see the benchmark for the CPU, 24.89. And then it proceeds in testing the memory speed. And we will also be able to see how much cache we've got. So we can see here the memory speed dipping right about the 8 kilobytes. So that's where it goes from, that's where the level 1 cache is, and then we should see another dip at 256. That's where the level 2 cache is. And that's really it in terms of benchmarking. So what we're going to do next is just showcase a few games and show what this machine can do.
vessel on the surface, Captain.
7-degree tilt. Climb to within 20 feet.
Águila 447, cruzando el vector 75, dirección Foxtrot 9, siguiendo con la misión. What are you doing, son?
New Atlanta, Sector 11, Building 71G. 7 April 2072.